On March 28, 2007, Circuit City announced a cost-cutting measure. The company would terminate 3,400 employees, not because they were underperforming, not because their roles were being eliminated, but because they were earning too much. Circuit City had calculated that these employees were paid above the wage cap for their positions. The solution was to fire them and replace them with people who would work for less. The employees who were fired were, by definition, the company's most experienced retail workers. They were the people who knew the products, knew the customers, and knew how to close a sale on a $1,500 television. The money Circuit City expected to save was approximately $1.8 million per week. Within 20 months, Circuit City filed for bankruptcy. Within 24 months, every store was permanently closed. This is the story of a company that understood exactly how to win in consumer electronics retail, and then made a single decision so completely at odds with that understanding that it destroyed everything they had built. Circuit City was founded in 1949 by Samuel Wurtzel in Richmond, Virginia. The original store sold televisions, the new technology that American households were rapidly adopting in the post-war boom. Wurtzel's insight was that televisions were complex, expensive, and intimidating. Customers needed someone to explain them. The store would succeed not just by having inventory, but by having knowledgeable staff who could guide a purchase. This philosophy, knowledgeable staff as competitive advantage, would define Circuit City for the next 5 decades. By the 1970s, Circuit City had expanded across the South. By the 1980s, it was a national retailer. The stores were large, bright, and comprehensively stocked. The sales staff were trained, product literate, and incentivized through commission. When a customer walked in to buy a VCR or a stereo or a television, they were met by someone who could tell them exactly why one product was better than another for their specific needs. At its peak in the late 1990s, Circuit City had more than 600 stores and revenues approaching $12 billion annually. It was one of the most respected retailers in America. Its brand was synonymous with expertise. The expertise was not an accident, it was the product. The trouble arrived gradually, then all at once. Best Buy had been growing steadily through the 1990s with a different model. Where Circuit City paid commissioned salespeople, Best Buy used a non-commission floor. Where Circuit City emphasized expertise, Best Buy emphasized selection and price. Best Buy stores were bigger, brighter, and cheaper to operate on a per-square-foot basis. The commission model that made Circuit City's staff so knowledgeable was also expensive. And as the consumer electronics market matured, as televisions and stereos became more standardized and less intimidating, the premium that customers were willing to pay for expertise began to narrow. Then came Walmart and Costco and Target, all entering the electronics space with loss leader pricing that neither Circuit City nor Best Buy could match on commodity products. Circuit City's board began to look for costs to cut. They found them in compensation. The company's most experienced salespeople, the ones who had been there longest, who knew the most, who were paid the most, had reached wage levels above what the company's new compensation structure allowed. The board made a decision. The experienced staff would go. New staff would be hired at lower rates. The customer experience would remain essentially the same. It would not remain the same. On March 28, 2007, 3,400 Circuit City employees received termination notices. The company was explicit about the reason. These employees had been paid more than their positions warranted under the current compensation structure. They were being let go to reduce costs. They were offered the opportunity to reapply for their own jobs at lower wages. The reaction in the press was immediate. The decision was widely described as among the most short-sighted in retail history. Industry analysts pointed out that Circuit City's primary competitive advantage, the one thing that differentiated it from Best Buy, from Walmart, from every online retailer, was the expertise of its floor staff. The company's response was that the customer experience would not be affected. New hires would be trained to the same standard. They were not trained to the same standard. Training takes time. Experience cannot be replicated in an onboarding program. The customers who walked into Circuit City stores in the spring and summer of 2007, many of them preparing to buy high-definition televisions as the format wars resolved, were met by staff who were new, uncertain, and unable to answer the questions that had previously made Circuit City stores worth visiting. Best Buy's comparable store sales increased measurably in the quarters following Circuit City's layoffs. The customers did not disappear. They went next door. The financial crisis of 2008 accelerated what was already a structural collapse. Consumer electronics is a discretionary category. When household spending contracts, televisions and laptops are among the first purchases deferred. Circuit City, already hemorrhaging customers to Best Buy, was now facing a market that had contracted sharply. Revenue fell. The stores that had already lost their most experienced staff were now struggling to move product in a category that consumers were actively deprioritizing. Circuit City attempted a series of recoveries. They sold their car audio installation business. They closed underperforming stores. They brought in new management. They attempted to restructure their supplier relationships. None of it was sufficient. The customer trust that had been built over 5 decades had been eroded in a single quarter by a cost-cutting decision that saved a fraction of what it ultimately cost. By mid-2008, Circuit City's credit ratings had been downgraded to junk. Suppliers began demanding cash payments instead of extending credit. The company's ability to stock its shelves, the fundamental operation of a retailer, was being compromised by its inability to pay for merchandise. On November 10, 2008, Circuit City filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing cited $3.4 billion in assets and $2.3 billion in liabilities. The company said it intended to use the reorganization to restructure and emerge as a viable retailer. It did not emerge. Over the following months, Circuit City attempted to find a buyer. No one was interested. Liquidators were brought in. The inventory was sold at discount. The fixtures were sold. The leases were abandoned. On January 16, 2009, Circuit City announced that all remaining stores would be closed and that the company would liquidate entirely. More than 30,000 employees lost their jobs. The last Circuit City store closed in March 2009. From the day of the 3,400 layoffs to the day the final store went dark was exactly 24 months. The $1.8 million per week that Circuit City had hoped to save in labor costs amounted to approximately $93 million over the period. The company's eventual losses were measured in billions. There is a number that appears in postmortems on Circuit City's collapse: $1.8 million per week. That is what the company expected to save by firing its most experienced employees. Here is another number. The market capitalization of Circuit City in early 2007, before the layoffs, was approximately $3.4 billion. By the time the bankruptcy was filed, it was essentially zero. The decision to fire 3,400 employees did not cause the 2008 financial crisis. The decision did not cause Best Buy's superior operational model. The decision did not cause Walmart's pricing power. But it did destroy the one thing that Circuit City had that its competitors did not: the trust of customers who believed that walking into a Circuit City store meant getting advice from someone who actually knew what they were talking about. Consumer electronics is a category where customers often spend more than they planned because someone convinced them that the upgrade was worth it. That conversation requires expertise. Expertise requires experience. Experience requires paying people enough to stay. The board that approved the March 2007 layoffs was solving for the wrong variable. They saw labor costs as the problem. The labor costs were not the problem. The labor costs were the product. The Circuit City brand was acquired after the bankruptcy. For a period, it existed as an online retailer. It has since been relaunched in various forms. None of these revivals have gained meaningful traction. What Circuit City left behind, beyond the closed stores and the lost jobs, is one of the most instructive case studies in how companies misidentify their competitive advantage. Every company has a core. The core is the thing that customers are actually paying for. Not the thing the company thinks they are paying for, but the thing customers would most immediately notice if it were gone. Circuit City's core was expertise. The board thought it was inventory and location. They found out the difference in March 2007. The lesson is not that cost-cutting is always wrong. The lesson is that you cannot cut the thing that customers are buying and expect customers not to notice. 30,000 people lost their jobs. Most of them had nothing to do with the decision that made their jobs impossible to keep.